Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. First, I would like to introduce Marcus Lehman, who is a two-time BERC Innovation Expo champion. His new technology, the Wave Carpet, produces both electricity and fresh water from tidal waves. And he is the first cohort in LBNL's M37 program. So please join me in welcoming and congratulating Marcus.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back from the break. It's always great to see at these conferences how the prices drop for solar and wind, and then also how new technologies reach full commercial stage, like tidal and offshore wind industry. And so at UC Berkeley Mechanical Engineering, we also want to provide additional solutions for the future, because we strongly believe that the key for a sustainable future is the usage of all possible resources. And one of the most underutilized resources is wave energy. In fact, according to the Department of Energy, wave energy can power 15 million homes in the US, and it's completely underutilized at the moment. And it comes with several advantages. It's more predictable, higher energy density, and several others. So our technology is based on a natural phenomenon of strong mud absorption. And then based on this, 2 years ago, we started developing a first prototype and achieved 40% efficiency by now in our wave tank experiments. The technology in general has three major advantages. It's more survivable, it's passive, so it doesn't cause any visual pollution, and it's also simple. So it's more survivable because only our innovative and patented area absorber is able to operate submerged, so it's not exposed to high forces on the surface, and thus is more survivable. So the technology generated significant traction. National Geographic named us one of the 5 striking concepts of harnessing wave energy. With the support of the M37 program now, we can work towards our goal, which is a first ocean pilot next year. And so I want to thank especially my undergrads for helping me throughout the research, and by the judges and everyone organizing the great BERC committee. And if you have questions, our poster is outside, so feel free to drop by and ask questions.
All right, well, thank you everyone again for coming and for such a great day. We have a wonderful keynote plenary to conclude the afternoon. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Paul Wright from Becky, who will be moderating this session.
Good afternoon. I'm going to start with no messing around. Let's start with Brooke at the end. Brooke is a partner at Sand Hill Roads, Kleiner Perkins, Colford & Byers. Next to him is a personal friend of mine and a Becky board member, John Woolard, who's the Vice President of Energy at Google. And then we have Helen Burt, who is the Senior Vice President and the Chief Customer Officer at Pacific Gas and Electric. And Cheryl Martin, who's also a friend of mine, who's the Acting Director of ARPA-E. And you all know who ARPA-E is. And so I'm going to begin with Brooke at the end to give a couple of minutes of introduction about yourself and the impact of your work on clean energy and so forth. And so please jump right in, Brooke.
Great, thanks, Paul. I'll keep it brief. My name's Brooke Porter. I'm a partner at Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield & Byers. I sit both in our venture group and our growth fund, focused on sustainability investing. I've been there for about 4.5 years, focused on sectors like energy storage, renewable materials, agriculture, and transportation. Prior to joining Kleiner, I was a 3-time entrepreneur, worked in fuel cells, biofuels, and educational services. And it's great to be back here on campus. I'm a UC Berkeley alum, studied chemical engineering here about 15 years ago. So thanks.
That's great. John, over to you. And do talk about your BrightSource work, of course, before you became the VP of Energy at Google.
Okay, no, glad to. First, it's really encouraging and very cool to see a room this full on energy at Berkeley. I graduated in '97 from Haas, and there was one person in the class of 240 that actually was thinking about energy. And I had to spend a lot of my time up at Lawrence Berkeley Labs just to be able to be around an environment of people that wanted to focus on it. So this is it's tremendous to see a full house, and it's a great forum. Real quick, after I left business school, I went and I spent 6 months at PG&E. Didn't last long there.
We'll hear more about that later.
I can't wait.
And a couple of us left, and we started a company that did about 2 gigawatts of demand response programs back in the late 90s. We worked a lot with PG&E and with Edison after that. And in fact, I see Brian Goncher out there in the audience, who did a lot of work with our company early on. And after we did that, we sold it to Itron in 2003, and I helped with making sure the customers and employees and everybody landed well. And then was told by my wife, who's the smartest one of the two, that I needed to take some time off. So I went to back up to Lawrence Berkeley Labs and was not allowed to work. But I was able to think a little and get some perspective, and started to look at the big challenges that were coming, and a lot was around the intermittency of renewables and how to get dispatchable power, and how to get renewables that were actually dispatchable. So we tackled the challenge through solar thermal. We actually built up a company called BrightSource that did the largest solar thermal project in the U.S. For a while, it was the largest solar project in the U.S. It's 400 megawatts of solar thermal power. The project, and PG&E is an off-taker for that, and Google was actually one of the investors in it. And after we got those projects up and running, I left BrightSource and started to look at how to make it, what the next step or the next piece was for me. And I wanted to land in a place that had an interesting, that had some heft, and was a good platform where you could do multiple things, and was fortunate enough to land at Google. Really quickly, because I could go in for, Google does a lot in energy, but the quick summary is we are a big user of power, so we actually 3% of the world's power is in data centers, and ours are twice as efficient as the average, so we do a lot of efficiency first, and that's what, I think it's really important to do efficiency first. We then buy quite a bit of renewable power through PPAs as an off-taker, and then we've invested about $1.5 billion in various renewable projects along the way. Generally a little forward-leaning, so we are project finance investors, but we try to push, help accelerate and projects that are right at that gap, have been fully de-risked. We have strong engineering, and we think we can come in and make sure that it's safe enough, and then we'll put some, we put $1.5 billion into growing 2.5 gigawatts of various, usually more innovative and more interesting deals. Once they become plain vanilla, we tend to back out, and then it becomes more commoditized. So more to talk about later.
That's great. I think there's plenty of questions that can come from the floor on the vision of Google. And as you know, on the handy-dandy iPad that I have here belonging to Tia, if you'd like to feed in questions as we go along, I'd be happy to jump right in to keep this very kind of punchy, interactive, and to be a little more entertaining. Also, John has his son Whit with him, I believe, today. Hi, Whit, the youngest member in the group, probably. If you look at the carbon data, he has more to lose than most of you, so listen hard and make his future very bright. And also, I hear he's an ace lacrosse player as well, so he's going to be a tough guy to stand up to. To Helen, it was very nice to meet you. Helen, over to you. With that, I don't think she brought her family today, but she's going to introduce some important things too.
Sorry about that, I didn't do that. So my name is Helen Burt. I am Senior Vice President. Up until about a month ago, I was Chief Customer Officer as well at Pacific Gas and Electric Company. I've been there about 8.5 years, and as Chief Customer Officer, it was my role to manage the portfolio of energy efficiency, demand response, all of our customer outreach, high-touch customer pieces, along with the other utilities in California. We have a very large portfolio. Today, I'm actually Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs, so it's actually my job to help move energy policy forward at both the national and state level. And prior to coming to California, I've been in the utility industry for a couple of decades, and so I worked in Texas and went through market deregulation in Texas as a regulated and a deregulated entity, and then came to California.
Good. Welcome. It's very nice to have you here. Thank you. And last but not least by any means is Dr. Cheryl Martin, who is the acting director of ARPA-E. And as you know, that's the most forward-looking government group to spearhead clean energy work. And so let's hear from Cheryl on latest things.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here today. I actually spent a good part of the day yesterday around campus with various faculty and students who are actually working on projects with ARPA-E. So I think hopefully some of you are aware of those and potentially involved in those. There's a lot of really great energy innovation going on. Just to give a little background, I came to this role directly from Kleiner Perkins. Brooke and I were colleagues for a couple years, and before that, though, spent 20 years in the chemical industry. Unfortunately, my PhD is from MIT, but I did move from technology, market, investor relations, financial planning, ran a few businesses, and along the way learned that energy was not something to be taken for granted. I dealt with plants that went down because we had rolling blackouts in South Africa and pay $1 million to get an electrical hookup in Russia and have to put desal in because in Turkey my plant didn't have any water. So for me, coming back to the United States, energy was not a commodity. It was something that I had to think about a lot. And so when the opportunity came to go to ARPA-E to help push forward the whole idea of transformational energy technology, that you also are working to bring the partners that are going to allow it to move forward, was too good a chance to pass up. So I've been there the past 3 years, the past 2 years as acting director, and really working on our technology to market model. Where we do start every conversation, we say, here, we have a check for you, and what happens when that money's gone? And so I'm sure as academics, that's not the first thing you want to hear, but we think it drives a different sort of conversation about outcome and thinking from the end, and really drives you to think about partners and next steps. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation here, and very much appreciate the fact that all of you are here at 4 o'clock on a beautiful Friday afternoon.
Thank you. So I want to thank Noah wherever he is. There he is. Noah has been the very good orchestrator of this panel, and what he asked me to do was to then each propose a question to each one of the panel members, which goes something like this: that when we had to work collaboratively with the energy innovation ecosystem, parentheses, that's startups, utilities, investors, regulators, and policymakers, those 5. Startups, utilities, investors, regulators, and policymakers. What was your experience to work with them and try and shift the needle energy-wise? And actually, I thought I'd pick on you, Helen, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
I'm a big fan of smart meters because in my Becky organization in 2004, we built the prototypes of smart thermostats and smart meters for the rollout, and then I was very disappointed that it turned into a public relations challenge, for example. That it did. And just since it's Friday afternoon, I can be a bit humorous. I live in Marin County on the west side, and there were these nutcases that were just laying down in the road, preventing PG&E from even installing the smart meters. You remember that too, right?
I do. And in fact, they arrested some of our people.
So it's interesting. And that tees up a question rather nicely, that you have this fabulous technology. Everybody wants to do it that thinks about climate to reduce the number of power plants that we have in California. And yet we didn't quite think it through public relations-wise, I guess. So over to you now. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. So let me speak a little bit about it from the utility industry. So I think I would say in California, policymakers in California have always been much ahead of where the rest of the country is. Mm-hmm. And so I must tell you that in 2004, we first began to put our plans in place for our smart meter rollout. The smart meter industry was rather in its infancy at that point in time.
That's true, yeah. That's 10 years ago, right?
Yeah, it was.
That's a long time in an energy company.
Exactly. And so we actually began setting our smart meters in 2007. And by the time the folks in western Marin County laid down in the road, we had about 6 million smart meters installed all over California.
That's right. That was good.
So it was one of those things where the individual felt not heard by the policy. And I think that's an important thing to think about. And I must confess that as an industry, I think we were naive. I think we were tone deaf. And I'll give you 2 examples. To a person who's worked in the utility industry for any period of time, a meter is nothing different than a pole or a transformer or any other device that enables energy to come from one place to another. And it truly, to our industry, really appeared to be just another thing that we use in serving customers. And why would customers care? They don't particularly care about what sort of transformer they might, they don't even know, because they're not that engaged with energy. I think what we all missed, and what we all missed really spectacularly, is the fact that meter's on someone's home makes it entirely different to a consumer. And when you put the consumer lens on that, you can understand that.
Yeah, right.
So I will tell you, we have 9.8 million meters
Big success now.
today.
Uh-huh.
We still have 2 communities, by the way, both in Marin County,
Yeah.
that really have city ordinances against smart meters. And when I say as recently as last year, some of our employees were threatened to be arrested
That's
for,
true. That's
for
true. Yes.
violating that. So
Uh-huh.
we try to be very respectful. We have opt-out ordinances in place, and we're trying to allow customers to make that decision on their own. And some are choosing to opt out. So that's sort of the smart meter lesson. I think that's one of the lessons of sort of our company going first in this. We were much further along than any of the rest of the companies, largely because of the policy making in California.
Right.
Being so.
This is a great answer, and I think another, if I can segue to John, of a company that came first, BrightSource was in that category, right? In terms of really a fantastic technology that you would have liked to see on the grid more quickly, but there were barriers that you faced in terms of certain legislative action and the issues around sustainability of the local environment and animals and all those things. That's true,
question.
right?
Okay.
Yeah, that question. So, okay, you can make it a short answer if you like.
There's quite a bit to cover in that category of there's an interesting tension out there between the environmental community and the energy community that is very tough, and it's a very tough one to parse and to sort through. And everybody has a romantic notion that you can put solar on the rooftop of every home and that'll solve it all. But at the end, we've actually looked at some of the math. If you put solar on every rooftop in the country, you get about 8%. You solve everything. You solve about 8% of the problem. You've got, you need wind. You need a lot of wind. We've got a very big problem to address, and we need a lot of wind. We need a lot of solar. We need solar in different places. You need backup power. So it's very complicated. It's a and then that doesn't even address the fuels part of the equation. So you can electrify the car fleet, so this scale issue, if we're dealing with climate change, is at odds with this very interesting the local environmental issues. And so you're looking at species issues that are local versus species issues, frankly, because that's one of the big issues around climate change is the habitat, the species and the biodiversity challenges that are more intertemporal and are going to be affected over time. And we went through unbelievable. We were at a place where we had some desert tortoise. It was about 1/10 of the density of a healthy tortoise population, but we still ended up, and we volunteered to move the tortoise, but we had to offset with took $43 million to handle 133 tortoise. And we ended up having massive survival rates. It was all good at the end. But if you think about $43 million and what you could do from a climate perspective, still protecting the same amount of tortoise, but do it in a way that's a little more thoughtful.
John, what was the gap between when you could have gone on the grid versus when you went on the grid because of that? What, was it a year or 2 years? Or
a 2-year delay, and probably lost 2 or 3, probably 500 megawatts to a gigawatt of projects that didn't get done.
Yeah.
So
it's not just the $43 million of the turtle moving; it's the time and the
all
lost,
sacrificed.
Yeah.
And that's not unique to us. I think that James Hansen came out just in the last week and was saying that he's a little controversial. I mean, the way he frames things can be rather dramatic, but he said if you want to do anything to solve climate change, look at the environmental groups that you support, and if they're not supporting nuclear power, resign or pull because you can't solve some of this without nuclear.
Yeah.
And that framed it in an interesting way.
Yeah.
So I think there is a tension, and it's going to be a tough one over time to deal with.
Right.
But the good news is it's solvable.
Yeah.
And there's some really good groups out there, Greenpeace, Environmental Defense Fund, NRDC. There's some that's the thoughtful center.
Yeah, okay, good.
If you will. There's some people that are really thinking about it in the right way. It's the 3 standard deviations from the mean where you get some challenging, some challenging stuff.
So that actually segues nicely to Brooke, and actually it's an honor for us to have Bill Quirk, who's the assemblyman for Haywood, I believe. Is that is correct? My memory is doing fine here. And he asked a question which Brooke might be able to answer in relation to these 2 questions. What is the best way for the state of California to commercialize innovative energy technologies? If you wear your Kleiner Perkins hat and think that through, and you could say to Bill, who could say to somebody else, you should do this, what would it be?
Wow, that's a loaded question. On the policy side, I guess I'll say as an entrepreneur, I probably experienced this more firsthand, trying to develop projects and looking at regulation as a guidepost for what to do as an entrepreneur.
Okay.
I thought that was, I guess I had a lot more faith in the regulatory environment really being dependable in terms of timing and quantity of reductions demand. And this was particularly around the low carbon fuel standard, my specific experience. And it was disappointing to me interacting with, say, major energy companies, oil companies. I'd go to Houston and try to explain the regulatory framework in California and say, hey, do you realize what's about to happen? You're gonna lose market share. Gasoline demand is going to decline if you don't do something. And I was just amazed at the sort of, they would literally laugh and say, there's really no way this is going to happen. We'd rather invest in blocking policy than trying to actually act and respond to it.
They killed my bill last year.
There you go. So I don't want to be too negative or sound too jaded, but I can just be honest and say, as an investor, I can't really afford to spend any time worrying about the regulation because it just doesn't drive what the companies do. I think, maybe just to take it in a slightly different direction, I think what this sector has learned over the last 10, 15 years is that, this isn't about just addressing sort of in a silo certain regulatory issues or just going after climate. The biggest changes, the biggest impacts are happening from great entrepreneurs solving real problems for consumers, touching all the way down to the consumer. One side of the consumer debate is, do I want a smart meter attached to my house? But I think the more interesting side of the debate is, how do utilities relate to consumers? They've never actually had to deal with customers' real demands. What do they want? And companies that are using sustainability as a design criteria to make better products are actually having a much more significant impact. You look at what Nest has done, for thermostats and managing building efficiency, or what Tesla has done for the transportation sector, or even what Uber is doing for the transportation sector. None of these are driven by regulation, right? They're driven by making great products, passionate entrepreneurs that want to change the world and do something great. And there's a foundation there of technologies that enables these companies to exist. Uber wouldn't exist without GPS and smartphones. Tesla's showing that you can do amazing things with cars. The recent announcements about autonomous driving and torque vectoring for incredible performance is built on the back of innovations on battery packs. So there's a whole bunch of interesting areas that are opening up. But I have a hard time connecting that to a regulatory framework. And I think more and more there's sort of a divide. One of our partners that I'm fortunate to work with is Al Gore, and I find it interesting that he talks about how much impact the business community is having, and that real solutions are coming not from government but from business. And speaking to students here, I think a lot of people are disenchanted by our political system. And so I'm actually hopeful that we can use technology to even innovate and improve our policy, our world of government and policy to reinforce that connection. Maybe there's ways to just reconnect these worlds that I feel today are very separated. So I don't know if that.
This is great. So now it's. I think you're the odd person. Actually,
no,
just before you speak.
Person out.
No, I mean you haven't spoken yet. That's what I mean. Noah Dyke, he asked a question, which is basically leading on from Brooke. How has energy innovation changed in the past 15 years And so if you could pick up from Brooke on the ARPA side, that would be good.
Yeah.
The federal side.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think building on what Brooke said, though, I think what we're seeing now is a tremendous opportunity where many technologies are coming together. And in that coming together, we are actually really changing what's possible, right? I think as we look 5-10 years from now, we won't be able to say, oh, Edison should just come back and run the grid. It's just, that's not going to happen now. And I think in the language of ARPA-E, what was the impossible is now very plausible. And I think we're all moving to a time when it does become inevitable. We will have the world is no longer flat issue. And we see it very dramatically that the cost and availability of grid-scale storage, we see it in distributed generation from a cost of things like solar, fuel cells, all different types of technologies on the distributed side, as well as the whole idea of routing the grid. The hardware and software to route the grid is becoming real. And so I think from the entrepreneurship community coming together to build those things together, I think it's causing larger companies to think about how do we play in this, right? We don't have integrators of technology yet, really, right? It's one-off, kind of bringing things together. So who's going to play in that? Is it going to be Google's? Is it going to be GE's? Is it going to be the utilities? What's everybody's role? And so I think that there's a very unique time built on technology, but where the pieces are starting to slot together. That is very exciting, and it causes us to think about things, even the whole nat gas, revolution, right? The nat gas vehicles where you could use the infrastructure in your homes to actually fuel nat gas vehicles if we could come up with conformable tanks. So we see this happening every day, that entrepreneurs are knocking down the problems. The solutions are starting to come together, and it's making all the pieces of this ecosystem really rethink things in ways I don't think 3 or 4 years ago we thought that as a group, this was going to happen so quickly.
Good. Well, I'm very interested in all these questions. I'm sure you are. Keep funneling things in here. So Rice Lemons, for example, asked for John and Helen. John, why don't you go first? The impact of demand response as a California technology. That's been here for 10 years, quite clearly, coming up the gradient all the time. Is that a big game changer for you from a Google perspective?
Sure, I'll even start further back because demand response, to me things get interesting when you hit a gigawatt. And I think it was around 2001, 2000 when you had about a gigawatt of demand response. We did about half of that with PG&E. And so we started early, and the old programs were effective, but they were early. They were kludgy, and it's amazing the difference now. I mean, if you look at the sophistication, and we're still early in this game, there's 72 gigawatts of demand.
72?
Response.
So it's gone from 1 gigawatt
from 1 to 72
in a period of 12 years, something
quickly.
like that. That's good.
And
is that in California or?
That's not worldwide, but across the U.S. So in the U.S., we have 72 gigawatts of demand response, but it's still slow and kludgy. It's still, sometimes you look inside the commercial and industrial market, and there's it's gone from a pager and SneakerNet to turn something on and off to a smartphone notification and SneakerNet to go turn something on or off or to reprogram it. They still have not, nobody's really yet connected the dots here, and I think there's a lot to be done.
Good.
And there's a lot
So that's definitely a space where we can really exploit new opportunities, right?
Yeah, and a lot. I'd love to hear the way Helen thinks this is going to go, because right now load's not really participating in the market like generation.
I see.
And it probably should.
Yeah.
So there's no difference in generating, as long as you can make sure that you make up for if you can't deliver. You have penalties.
Yeah,
but
sure.
It really should be, the system's almost indifferent to it, and as long as it's just as responsive, the way those two interact, we could finally have a real-time matching of supply and demand.
Yeah, good. Helen, I'm sure you're going to pick up with that very crisp description.
And in fact, it is starting to move where demand response is bidding into the marketplace. It's in its nascency. However, I think it is one of the areas that you're really going to see innovation, and it's where the Nest can actually play on the consumer side all the way up the chain. The problem with bidding into the marketplace is that it's really sophisticated players who can do that, who really have the wherewithal to actually bring that. So you're not going to see consumers do that. That's why it has to sort of be done for them. And the sneaker net is a great example of how it used to be done. I should tell you, though, in California, the very first demand response programs began in 1959. So I know that you guys, as you look at the future, you're seeing an amazing future around energy and policy and how you can totally change things. But there have been people thinking about this for a while.
Yeah, that's right.
And we see demand response as an incredible part of how you make renewable energy, how you backstop renewable energy. You know, John was talking about the fact that it's going to take rooftop solar, it's going to take wind, it's going to take all sorts of sources. It's also going to take demand response and energy efficiency.
Yeah.
Those have a whole new lifetime and a whole new practice ahead.
So
Can I
go
just-
ahead, Brooks. Yeah,
I
go
just
ahead.
want to make sure that people know kind of where demand response is going. Just to add on what John said, I think the way it historically was done, it was always a trade-off between basically pissing consumers off and turning off their air conditioning when it was hot, and trying to achieve what the grid needed. And with technologies like Nest, you can do it in a way that consumers don't even notice. Right? It doesn't impact their lives at all. And yet they benefit from getting their rush hour rewards program. You can make $8-10 a month by opting into a system that doesn't really cost you anything because it's not changing the way your comfort, your convenience, and that's what's really changed in my mind is that finally the consumer is actually part of this equation and what they want, and that's being enabled by, I think for the first time, Nest.
Yeah.
And why do you have the microphone, Brooke? John Romanko has asked how we can innovate more in electric vehicles. So that again, I'm guessing you would say, is to provide ways in which it can happen seamlessly, right? And the consumer is benefiting and very pleased, and also maybe contributing back to the grid. So please jump in on that too.
So there's a couple perspectives. One perspective is, are batteries good enough to make a viable electric vehicle today? I think that box has been checked by Tesla. They built the best car in the world, and it just happened to be electric. But it was the best performing car in the world, right? 2014, car of the year. But that's great for a very small sliver of the population that can afford one, right? And so that doesn't move the needle at all on climate change and big energy issues. So to really achieve mass adoption, we have to get the cost of batteries down. You got to get the performance of batteries up, but it's really about cost. There are a number of innovations around. So one thing is core battery technology. We're not going to 10x batteries. I just don't think that's physically possible. We're going to see significant improvements. We're taking some sort of moonshot grand challenges at the space. We've made 4 investments in battery companies. So we see a lot of opportunity to improve batteries. But there's also a lot of improvement in infrastructure, right? One of the things that really frustrates me as I drive from the South Bay, I come to Berkeley, I think there's 2 charging stations on campus. I mean, it's crazy, right? There's charging stations all over the Bay. The biggest desert of charging is right here in Berkeley. So we need better charging infrastructure. You put a couple fast chargers around the city and battery systems, that can enable or be capable of charging with fast charging. As soon as that comes about, and it's rolling out with standards and other things, but in the next few years it'll get there. It'll be much more convenient, and I think it's coming. So,
And if I could, I think this is a place policy and utilities can play a role. So today in California, utilities are not allowed to put electric vehicle charging stations in.
Why is that?
It's a rule. So
they can't own the assets.
we absolutely cannot
why that is?
invest in the assets.
This is actually really important.
Here's that guy. We're going to get you to go into.
So we should rate-base fast chargers, right?
Honestly, when you want to, let's talk about California energy policy, right? It had tremendous foresight in really building the market around solar. Absolutely, and that was policy-driven. It was policy-driven out of Sacramento and policy-driven at the CPUC. We've not taken the same step when it comes to electric vehicles. And I will tell you, our fleet of vehicles that you see coming out to repair your home is mostly electrified. We are the only utility that uses electric bucket trucks. And we hope someday to be able to keep neighborhoods from going out at all as we back charge from the batteries. But we are prohibited from really investing in the infrastructure around electric charging. And to me, this is what a monopolistic utility can bring to the table and the value that policy can get driven in that way to really make it better for everybody.
The other thing that the utilities can do, and maybe there's a quid pro quo here with regulation, is to modify the demand response charges. We have an electric bus company, Proterra, and it's a fantastic solution for urban mass transit with zero emissions. But one of the challenges is the rate structures are oftentimes prohibitive and eliminate a lot of the savings because you get nailed with these peak demand charges. So in my view, electric transportation is the biggest opportunity, right? You're transferring basically ExxonMobil market share to utilities. Right. Utilities might lose some market share to rooftop solar, but they can gain it back and more with electric transportation. We just have to get the rate structure right.
And if we're ever going to be totally AB 32 compliant in the state of California and continue to lead in greenhouse gases, it has to be done with electric vehicles. It absolutely has to.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
Okay. Bill, it sounds like five of us are going to sign up to get you another bill that you're going to lead. Right? Is that good on this topic? That's why you're okay. Good.
I got one more actually, which is if we were taking notes, I might as well throw one on the list.
Don't beat up on Bill. He's gone
No,
off
this
on his
is
shoulders
good.
already.
This is good. Just back to the sort of Uber issue, right? I mean, there are solutions that are, technology and business and entrepreneurs are well ahead of regulatory policy. We have to keep the consumer in mind, both from a sort of business utility perspective, but from a government perspective. If people want a solution, let them have it, right? Let's not protect the horse and buggy industry here.
Okay, that's good. So actually, let's go to Cheryl now because we've had a little strength about California, right?
Yeah,
and understandably, this is where we're sitting. But there are things that the federal government can do to avoid the sort of valleys of death in all these fields, not just commercially, but in terms of rollouts. And I know ARPA-E is doing fantastic things in that area. But what other federal agencies do you think are really helping to move in the right directions that you heard from our three other panelists here?
Oh gosh, you're asking somebody who's only a three-year total employed by the government a question well beyond my pay grade.
But I think that's a good question.
No,
for
but
us to
I
kick
think
around with.
I think if I look at Department of Energy as a whole, and I think about what's the purview of what it's doing, right? We've got Office of Science and this tremendous network of national labs looking at how do we best use the resources we have and make them accessible to folks to move technology ahead fast, right? That's a really huge basis upon which nothing else happens. You have to have the basic science or we don't build the rest of this.
Right.
And we look at then what are all the applied areas and everything from, again, to Brooks, these are big problems. We need all these solutions. So you look at what the Office of Electricity is trying to do with testing things like a Berkeley project, right, synchrophasers, right? What can we do to understand the impact of these and what that can tell us about what's happening on the grid? They're doing testing in those areas. Fossil energy, the larger scale projects they're doing on carbon capture. Again, maybe not as applicable in California, but if we look at a nation and the world, really important pieces happening there. And energy efficiency and renewable energy all across the board, right? From what Sunshot's been doing to push solar itself down, right? And both flat panel as well as concentrated.
Right.
You look at the wind program, all these programs, right? Really looking at how do you get public-private partnerships between labs and local communities to give you access to resources that allow you to look at deployment. As from ARPA, so I think across the department, we're doing a lot of things across these areas. We work really hard now to have conversations across DOE about where we're starting things, how those need to be picked up, where the private sector going to be involved, where are regulations going to potentially get in the way, even though that's not our purview, but we're flagging some of those things.
Yeah.
So I do think across the board, DOE is doing a lot. I think, the other departments, depending on what the situation is, if it's on water side, different people control different pieces of this, right? Which makes it a complex problem. Sure. DOE is leading the effort for the quadrennial energy review, which looks across government. I think that's important that we have a conversation across government about how does everybody play together. But I think from innovation perspective, we're very excited about where things are. And I think electric vehicles, everything from battery innovation to control systems, thinking about batteries in new ways, safer batteries, they could be an integral part of the car. So the whole thing of not just today's cars, not just where the Tesla is today, but where and how can we envision cars in the future.
Good. Good. Actually, while you have the microphone, and my friend Carl Blumstein is over there, we're proud in Becky to have an ARPA-E contract on micro-synchrophasers. And that seems to be an important area of grid development, these technologies that are going to make the grid more resilient to electric cars, intermittency, smart feeder. I mean, every one of the other panelists has got some technology that will really accelerate into the grid if we build a more advanced grid. Would you agree that we need more investment
absolutely.
in that?
No, because I think, it has been the past 10 to 15 years of the smart meter evolution, and I think now we're really moving into the smart grid, right, where we do mean something different than just the meter itself. And so everything from microsynchrophasers, power flow control, can we really actually control the flow of electrons, to high voltage DC, how and why can you think about microgrids and a macrogrid and backing each other up? You have to have two-way power flow control, right? But those things are starting to be real, right? And we're seeing software development. I mean, AutoGrid in the Bay, right? There's all kinds of things being demonstrated today. And I think what we're logically seeing is the evolution you might expect, that software, because you can test it on data sets on the side and decide how it works. If it fails, you can go iterate on it. Well, it's harder to do with a power flow controller. It kind of only works when there's power in it. So we're seeing the software move first, but we're very, very excited about all of these developments coming together to really give us a very much more robust, controllable grid, whether you care about it from integration of renewables or reliability or just resiliency.
Okay,
right?
Good. So now it's we're about halfway through, I think, maybe 2/3 through. So I'm going to take the gloves off a little now and start asking some hard questions. For example, that was the warm-up.
Well, you started with smart meters on me, so I'm not sure I can say.
Well,
We started with smart meters and turtles.
Smart meters, turtles, and
okay.
protests.
But seriously, now we're going to get into some tough stuff. Bill Quirk is another one from Bill. We're getting into
You're going to have to stop giving people's names, or they're not going to send the
No,
hard questions.
He's a tough guy. He doesn't mind. Well, wouldn't you agree? I mean, it doesn't matter. Anyway, so cap and trade. This is a great question. Would it make sense for California to use cap and trade funds and/or creation of markets to partner with ARPA-E to commercialize energy technologies? I can read the question again if you need to take a breath.
So it's a question for me.
Well, it says that here, yeah. So, okay. I mean, you can't weasel out of it now, Cheryl. Sorry.
No, so...
He even called you Dr. Martin, to be respectful, you see.
Oh, nobody ever calls me Dr. Martin, so that's a flag. No, so I think, actually ARPA-E has an MOU with the CEC here in California for a very good reason, right? We signed the MOU because we believed that where California was positioning itself, looking to the future, the efforts under the new funding, under the EPIC funding, were directionally aligned with projects we're running to get them into the deployment, the demonstration, and eventually the deployment phase. So we are very excited about that relationship with California. And I think that recognizing, what I worry about most is we put out there really high bars from a performance cost perspective, and we get early stage people, technologies willing to jump over that bar. And they jump over and they demonstrate it, but it's not ready for the market. It is absolutely not ready to be on the grid. So where and how do you get the $5 to $20 million of early pilot plant demonstration funding that's absolutely needed to be able to go up and be credible either from a warranty or UL listings, or we could rattle through all the things you have to have. And so I think any state, as it thinks about what can it do from a value proposition of what it wants to have happen to provide some funding in partnership with others to move these things forward is an awesome way to do this. I wouldn't say any one way has to be the way. Right now we're working within the EPIC funds, with projects that we see pick up. But I think it's important, and I think there's only a certain number of states in the country that really have the forward-looking policy and the capital to potentially think about that. But I think where it can happen, it's awesome. And I think it provides models for other places to then step up.
That's a great answer, actually. Brooke, would you like to jump in on that too?
Yeah, I think, if we look across the sort of the value chain of companies from sort of early stage R&D all the way through commercialization, the place that I'm worried about the most is in the really early stage fundamental R&D, the stuff that ARPA-E funds. I think the commercialization gap is a very important one, and ARPA-E is lucky to have people like Cheryl there to help guide these technologies through. But if I looked at, where can you get the best bang for the buck, I would take those dollars and I'd put them into fundamental R&D. And that's where we need massive amounts of additional spending across across the government.
That's a very nice thing to say.
And so I think that's what I'm most worried about, is that it's less to me about the valley of death of commercialization. I think the industry's sort of sorted out how that's going to work. I think it's still very real, but there's sort of a dry funnel of death where I'm worried about the funnel running empty because there's just not as much money going into early stage investments of technology companies in energy. And so I think those dollars going into that early stage is going to be, I think, an area of big impact.
Okay, that's an interesting comment. If I'm thinking about this audience, they might be somewhat surprised by that statement, in a good way, right? Because this is mostly entrepreneurs in energy thinking the value of death issues are the things. What you're saying is the front of the pipeline, deep science and technology that you're advocating. Is that right?
There are companies that have made it across the valley of death. You could argue that the Teslas and other big ones wouldn't have made it without some significant government help. So I don't want to discount the value of that.
Right.
But there are companies that will make it. That great technologies with great entrepreneurs can build companies in this space. But I just see, from my perspective as a venture capitalist, I just don't see a lot of people investing in the early stage.
Okay.
I think Alon Gore's here. He's trying to innovate on this model of where do you take fundamental science and sort of give them a home for innovation, sort of expanding on the ARPA-E model. I think there's a real need for more dollars to go into that space because while technology is going to, can enable and create a lot of interesting businesses, we still have fundamental science problems to solve to really tackle climate change.
Okay, that's good. John, what's your thoughts on this?
I've done 2 companies myself, and if you have your technology in place and your team right, I've never had a problem lining capital up. It's not easy. It doesn't just show up at your door, but if you really, I agree completely with what Brooke's saying. We need more investment in basic science. We've got some really serious basic science problems. We don't have the solutions out there, and people who say it don't think understand the way the electrical system really works. It's not cost effective yet, and just solving something like PV doesn't solve intermittency, and just having wind that's cheaper doesn't solve some of these really complicated issues. Brooke mentioned storage earlier, material science, going deep into how you're going to solve. It's going to take breakthroughs, because if we look at and I hope some of your high leverage 1 in 10, your 10x bets pay off on storage, because we're going to have to break through. If we look at the forward curve of Tesla's, lithium ion storage on their gigafactory, it still doesn't get to, it helps for electric vehicles, but it really doesn't get you much more than that. It doesn't make it cost effective
in grid storage,
grid scale or any of that. And pump storage is still more cost effective. Pumping water uphill and running it downhill is still. That and a peaker are the 2 things to beat, and we're not even close. So we need a lot of serious, deep research. I think it's material science is one of the most important areas, and nanotechnology sounds, like cliched, but diving deeper into new and novel materials and ways to
electrolytes
store,
that have nanoparticles in them, that kind of thing.
Is really key, and I think that's going to be fundamentally important because we look out over 20 to 30 years, and we're not going to run out of problems to solve in the power sector. We could run out of technologies to solve them if we're not investing early.
So ARPA-E tries to get that balance right between deep science and what happens in, as Ilan would say, in month 37. So is that?
Yeah, no, I mean, we invest in things, so when ARPA-E decides if they're going to fund something, the question is, if it works, will it matter, right? We don't actually ask for them to already have demonstrated that it does work, right? It's really saying, if this particular piece of science can be distilled into a technology, that it will matter out there. And so I think to some of these battery questions, right, even the whole idea of control systems, how do we think about, understanding the health of a battery? So at the fundamental level, right? Today we measure state of charge and temperature. And neither of those really tell you about what's going on. And so how do we challenge ourselves with looking at what are some of the fundamental things going on so that we can get at some of these things and drive these costs and performance down and up sufficiently to go forward. So yeah, we worry about that all the time. What's that balance?
Good. So let's move on to some of these more tricky issues and just trying to get a sense from the panel. I mean, we recently just closed down our California Sanofi nuclear power station, right, which is going to make some challenge to the grid. I mean, it would just be nice to go across the panel now and get your gut level view on what's next in nuclear energy.
I think he wanted you to go first.
Okay. I saw that look.
I mean, I think
You're going to say more fundamental research. That's where you're going to go. That's,
we have to think about it. We have to address it head on.
Look,
right?
I think there have to be, I think it's great that there are companies out there today that venture capital is funded to try to take a shot at this. Right?
Good,
And
good,
I think
good.
that's fantastic.
The right thing to do.
And there are a lot of interesting new approaches, right? There's sort of new views on thorium. There's taking nuclear waste and trying to use that, the sort of microreactors. I think those are all really important, but there is not a lot of capital that's interested in making those investments, right? It's basically kind of the billionaires club that has the capital to sort of make these long-term wild bets. I just wish there was more fundamental research going on there, I think.
well, we just put out a FOA last month. RPE put out a FOA called Alpha that is looking at the intermediate density space and looking at drivers and plasmas to see if we can get fast learning to try to go after some of these problems. So that FOA is just on the street. So all I can tell you is we have money available. So we'll see what we get there.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Okay, John, I got distracted with Noah telling me we have to finish in 5 minutes or so. But,
Okay, I'll make it short. Nuclear is a tough one. First, if you look at the loss of San Onofre or any of these plants, if you look at Germany and Japan, from a carbon perspective, it is unbelievably large. People don't appreciate that. Just losing one nuclear plant in California is a third of all the renewables that were built to the tune of $50 billion in the state, kind of gone from a carbon perspective. So I think we need to focus a lot on how you maintain what you have and make it safe. But sometimes people confuse the old stuff with what's possible.
Yes.
And so people view nuclear as the stuff that was designed in the 60s and 70s, and they don't. I think there needs to be a lot more fundamental research on in a couple of key. I think Gen 4 fission is really key in looking at thorium reactors and really thinking about how do you eliminate some of those problems and make it safe and make it done in a way that's less water intensive. Water is a big issue with nuclear. So if you can solve some of those issues with new technologies, we need to be investing in it now so that 10 to 15 years from now, we're not saying, why the hell didn't we start 15 years ago?
Okay,
Because
that's
a long-term.
That's a great answer.
Can I just add one policy thing? Because I think one element that's missing here is making a level playing field, right? And the big risk in nuclear is, of course, catastrophic failure, and that risk is not included in the cost of electricity, right? It's offloaded on taxpayers.
Yeah.
And just like in crude oil, we don't pay for protection of the Persian Gulf. There's lots of imbalances here. So I would love to see sort of an alignment, not only on fundamental research, but an alignment of policy around how this gets priced so that it's a level playing field.
Yeah. So this is we're beginning to paint an optimistic view of all of these things. I think grid, electric vehicles, being more open to nuclear power in many different ways. Helen, would you ride that horse also?
I will. I absolutely will. I will tell you that I totally agree with John's comments about people underestimate the GHG effects of a nuclear plant being taken out of service. The fundamental issue with nuclear power as it's been designed is that it's basically what's called a base load power plant, which means it's made to operate all the time at full capacity, and that's the way the older plants that are in, that's the way they used to be built. Some of the new generation and the new thinking around nuclear is that they're more flexible. And so, as a GHG-free source that's more flexible, I do think we have to look at it. I think it's going to take more research.
Good.
Without a doubt. Not sure what you mean about taxpayers and about
Yes, I opened
putting
a
it
can of
onto.
worms, but-
Yeah, you did.
Good. Cheryl, your turn to weigh in on nuclear power.
No, I mean, I agree. I think that there's, this getting ourselves to where we want to be requires all of the answers, right, to be acted on. We need to go after the renewable sources, efficiency, grid efficiency in the end, and look at things like nuclear. We can't ignore it. It's too big an impact to just say we're going to ignore that. And so again, we're doing our part with looking at what we thought was an ARPA-E hard question, and really support that broad conversation, because there's no way we get there. Nobody's map gets us there without all these things having a lot of improvement.
Okay. What I really liked about those 4 answers is that our distinguished panel are viewing these optimistic views of the future, both from a science and technology point of view, and also from an open-minded point of view. And I think that's a real key element for our whole activity here. The last question of all, of course, is also in the same kind of space, and it relates to hydraulic fracturing in California. I mean, we know that the 4 big states in the Midwest are doing it with great energy production, lots of jobs, and a huge impact on their local economies. And yet, New York and California, of course, are much more leery about doing it. So with that little intro, having done the thumbs up or thumbs down on nuclear, what do we say about hydraulic fracturing, but especially related to California?
Again, I'll have to answer, more broadly. ARPA-E right now, our main look at this whole thing is if you're going to have all this natural gas moving around, what you need to be able to make sure of is that you understand what's the leakage from it, and that you can deal with that. And so just this year, we put out a funding opportunity called Monitor, that's looking at system-level answers to be able to identify so that you could go after and fix leaks of a certain size that would allow you to start to think about, keeping the emissions down across the distribution system. We're not going after pipelines in cities. That's not the focus of this. It's the big infrastructure. But recognizing if it's going to be there and if we're going to move it around, we got to make sure that we understand where it all is and if there's problems with it. Because unlike a lot of other things, it's not easy to see if there's a problem right away.
That's a great answer. Helen, what's your view of...
So this is not a business that we're in. I do think it's going to play out in California, and it's going to be something interesting to watch because, the conversation we had earlier about the turtles and how we think about bright sources work with just taking care of the turtles. I think you're going to see a lot of debate and appropriate policy debate from environmentalists on fracking. It's just, there's no question about it. The fact that natural gas is now readily available in the United States is not a bad thing.
Right. Good. John, your views, pro and cons hydraulic fracturing in California and more globally?
Yeah, I'll be short on California. I think we're going to study it a lot, and I think it's going to get so debated by the environmental community. It was hard enough to build a solar plant. It'll be very tough to move forward, and I think we'll apply some very rigorous standards, which is appropriate. Yeah. I want to reinforce what Cheryl said, though, because I think there's, fundamentally the massive discoveries of natural gas have taken part of the equation. It used to be decarbonization and energy security. And now we really do have massive supplies of fossil fuel in the U.S. because of hydraulic fracturing. And it's debatable what that means is interesting. So how good is that? What does it mean? And people have said, well, a gas plant is the conventional wisdom, which is not quite right, is a gas plant is half the carbon of a coal plant. Well, that compares it to an old coal plant, not a new coal plant. If you build a new coal plant, they're more efficient. So it's really only about 30% less. And then that assumes there's no methane leakage. But if you look at the methane leakage from the well to the burner tip, and if that's 3% through that complicated system, because methane is 23 times worse as a greenhouse gas, and you're now worse off. Yeah. And a lot of people don't like to go into that level of discussion. Their eyes glaze over when you start to talk about it. But it's not necessarily solving much of the problem other than the energy security piece. So let's accept it for what it is, but monitoring, being really careful, and nobody knows what I think that is one of the most important things you guys can do is people will, I was talking to one of the big oil majors who they do know in their field. And they told me that they were sort of around 1.5 to 2. Can't tell you who it was, and I actually believe but that's a big, sophisticated, knowledgeable company. It's all the others that are, my guess is on average it's not great, and we'll see.
Brooke, do you want to make a
Yeah, so I
comment on
think
this?
two things. One, completely echoed the leakage thing. The other issue is, of course, the water. The usage in California is a major issue today. You can't even begin to talk about fracturing, I think, in this environment. And then, of course, the emissions that come off after the fracking fluids come up above ground. That's one thing that sort of gets ignored, but it's a massive environmental problem. So one, just level the playing field on regulatory requirements. That's I think, the first thing. And the second piece I would just add on natural gas is, we should celebrate that we have this abundant low carbon resource. I think it's great, but we shouldn't squander it. So I would say let's try not to burn it. Right. Let's either electrochemically convert it in a fuel cell, create baseload power in a distributed way. That's one great use, or turn it into other useful things. Make chemicals and fuels out of it. Burning it is sort of a waste.
Good. So last question. And Dan and Tia and Noah know I'm an eternal optimist. We have a room full of brilliant people and a wonderful campus and lab. So I'm going to ask what I call the king for a day or a queen for a day. Brooke, as king for a day in energy, climate, and environment, what would you do? Most optimistically.
Well, I could say fusion, but I'll say put a price on carbon.
Price on carbon. Okay.
So I'm a realistic king.
Okay, that's good. John, king for a...
I would tax carbon, and I would make it something that's going to move the needle, which is frankly higher than what's being discussed.
Good.
Yeah.
I think
Queen for a day, Helen Burt.
I actually think that I would sort of reinvent the relationship between the grid and the consumer and the entrepreneur.
Okay, that ties into those two, actually. And Helen, Cheryl, queen for a day. What
Queen for a day. I would actually be the magic princess for a day, because I would go 10 years into the future and then come back, because the only thing we know about energy is that we don't know what's going to happen. And that's why we need options. We need all of this research. We need a lot of these things moving forward, and we need all of the enthusiasm and energy of you all, right? 5 years ago, we didn't know about the natural gas. We hadn't experienced Fukushima, and so why should we be so bold to say that we know exactly how the future will play out? And so that would be my wish.
Good. I'm going to stand up, applaud my wonderful colleagues here, and I invite you to...